Howdy, of you delicious people. I'm here today to review episodes 3 and 4 of a show called Nobody's Looking. Really, if you guys had watched my very first review of this, kind of a different setup, trying something different, trying to do some kind of imagery or something like kind of like pops a little bit more than previous and whichever and rough drafts and whichever, just kind of going back and trying like, how about I just have fun with images? So going into this episode, I'm still really enjoying this show, but you also get a point in time where it's there are certain characters that, in all brutal honesty, are kind of these funny but also annoying like characters. You end up having like this kind of give and take for these characters. Um, we really have it also to where really we're just kind of really having fun with these episodes. You can kind of tell that a lot of the characters in these episodes are just kind of having fun with their characters and really doing some fun things. We end up having Yuli that is to basically put on a mask of sorts that makes him look like Nicolas Cage, I guess, as a joke, to really just showcase that they're really playing up this whole City of Angels angle within this episode, which I thought was really fun. Also, going into this episode, or these two episodes, I should say, really the focus of these episodes are really with Miriam's relationship, and I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I might ill pronounce some people's names and whatever. Miriam, it seems to be mostly focused on where Miriam is going next with her relationship. And also, it seems that we have Yuli that is to eventually go on to these next next people that he's supposed to watch over, to where he is to try and go out of his way to eventually have their relationship seemingly be more open, more honest, and then eventually more also explorative or explorational, I guess, in a very cryptic like sense. Going on into these episodes, I find this show to be fun. I think the fact that we end up having Hewley, who is to try to undermine what a character like Fred is doing, which is actually his superior, is kind of fun. How we end up having Fred, who is to eventually retrieve out of some opening a nut to where he is trying to understand what the bigger meaning of this nut is, to where eventually Hewley ends up playing this joke further along because it just is ending up just uh, getting Fred uh, to leave Hewley alone and concentrate on whatever these pieces are coming from the great otherwise divine. Going into this show, I think that these episodes really showcase this show well, just because it really is the point of like these people finally cutting loose. Whereas before, like the two earlier episodes are really just to kind of give us the blueprint of what is going actually on in this show. Like it's kind of giving us the welcome mat and like showing us exactly what this show is about. Where these two episodes are just to kind of just have fun and explore, and also go into some sex areas within this show. If I can even say that correctly. Uh, Plus, we also have a big, huge party where reasonably, luckily, there isn't a huge amount of details within these episodes. Thank God. It's just having fun, and that's all it really is. So, really, I think that's all that I really had to say for Cryptic Sense for these two episodes. Really, I kind of like the fact that since we now have a character like Hewley that seems to much more know what's going on behind the scenes, and plus also I like the fact that this character continues to poke holes into anything that Fred is to say. I find that to be fairly interesting. So, with that said, I apologize. It has been a while since the last time I had reviewed this, just because like I was just kind of like looking at like okay, like is anybody still interested in this show? And then like I didn't see like a huge response right away, so I immediately was just like, oh, okay, well I'll just kind of just I'll just have that be a video that ends up going up. And then eventually I realized that eventually over time, people started to view it. And I'm like, oh, okay, great. Thanks everybody for watching that previous review. That's why, henceforth, I'm going to try to keep coming back to this and reviewing the rest of the season, knowing full well that people might have just been interested in this singular season, and that's perfectly fine. So, going on into here, let's, I think, dust out that double five to otherwise go into spoilers about the show. Reasonably, yeah. For those of you that just find this show fun and really come back to it from time to time and watch it, great. Like, I actually do enjoy this show too. I've watched this like, I'm going to probably watch this entire season twice now, because eventually, like, if anybody was to enjoy this show, let me know in the comments below. I will try to come back to it as much as possible. I've really just tried to enjoy doing much more movies than shows right now. But with that said, let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this episode. So, the third episode is very much more of reasonably Miriam and her boyfriend are kind of really deciding. Well, Miriam is much more really deciding that this couple that she is in just really isn't right for her anymore. We end up having Miriam who ends up breaking up with her boyfriend. And so we just end up having her boyfriend just kind of like saddeningly like starting to like put all his stuff in boxes. And we eventually have Miriam who is just kind of giving him like food and stuff like that to just say like, oh, well, here's yours also. And so we end up having eventually Hewley is to be on also double secret probation by Fred. We end up having Fred who is to go on to this nut and had taken 16 some odd hours to try to figure out what this nut represents. And I think Fred kind of mentions that that I think it's some kind of missing link of sorts, and to where Hewley is that missing link, to where Fred now has to want to cementingly have people still shadow over Hewley because he Fred feels that Yuli is not prepared enough, and plus the mistake of when he was to let his person that he had watched over die, because Hewley wasn't even in the same atmosphere of the guy of which that he was supposed to watch. We end up having Hewley who is to argue with Fred because Hewley ends up mentioning that the guy of which that he thought he was watching over, he thought that he was actually getting uh, a orgasm rather than being electrocuted. And we end up having Fred is like, well, you should obviously know the difference, like between the two. And Yuli's like, well, like, no, I couldn't tell the difference. Uh, I couldn't, like, I thought he was just having pleasure. Like, I thought he was just, I thought he was just, like, enjoying himself. So, we eventually have it to where Fred is like, no, like I'm gonna have to watch you or have someone watch over you like a hawk. Like this whole nut is telling me that there's a missing link here, that there is no screw, and we eventually have it to where Yuli ends up kind of throwing a wrench in what Fred eventually says. That eventually the world should actually, or you would think that the divine creator would give Fred a screw to eventually put that nut in, and we end up having Fred going like, whatever, like so what, like like we have it to where Yuli is trying to crush Fred's metaphor and so on and so forth. So eventually we end up having Yuli, who is to eventually look after Greta, because it seems that Greta is kind of giving up on everything. She basically has zero interest in actually doing her job anymore, because she's really starting to realize that she's like, what is the point? Like, you know what? I should just explore and have fun with my life instead of actually doing my job, because what is the point if all of this stuff is just going to be fed to some hamster at the end of all of this? What is the point? So we end up having Greta, who is basically going through a downward spiral, to where Greta is to eventually go to Miriam and ask her if she would have sex with her, because eventually we end up having Yuli within these two episodes. Eventually, Yuli does have sex with Miriam, because eventually, when Yuli shows himself to Miriam, eventually they get into some bedroom business, and really eventually we end up having Miriam, who is kind of surprised uh, how pleasing that this guy was, and how they were able to even have this sex moment, trying to say that as minimal as possible. So we eventually have also Greta, who wants to experiment. She wants to take drugs. She wants to eventually take weed, and eventually we end up having Greta mentioning that she is like she has never had sex before, and so we end up having Marion, who's like, oh, okay, well, I'm basically gonna help you out. Like, I'm gonna find you some freaky ash like characters that eventually will want to do something with you. And so we end up having Greta, who ends up having to put a coat on to hide her wings, and so we end up having Greta going on to uh, have her time with these people, which she ends up actually regretting, because she actually thinks that eating and pooping are far more exciting than actually having sex. I would assess. So going on in this episode, we end up having Yuli, who is to talk to this veterinarian, because we have Yuli, who is supposed to give this veterinarian a wing of his, but we end up having it to where it seems severely difficult for this veterinarian to get this wing out, to get this feather out. And so we end up having this whole entire time where Yuli is trying to make this up to this veterinarian in some other way. So really, so we end up having Marianne, who ends up dumping her boyfriend, to eventually, towards the end of this episode, kiss Yuli and eventually go and have them have bedroom business together. And really, that is the bulk of what ends up happening within this episode. We end up having Yuli, who is also trying to help Marian's boyfriend move on, to try to put together a speed dating like thing to help him figure out his next match, his next person. And so that is kind of a very interesting element of this episode. We also have it to where we are to eventually have Hewley, who is to be mentored by Fred via Yuli watching over someone. We end up having it to where it seems that Yuli had rigged the balls of which for him to get a certain person. And so, because everything just shoots out via hamsters, so we end up having Yuli who's rigging things so that way he can have certain people get certain people. So we have Yuli who is being watched over by Fred, and so we immediately have Fred, who I guess is a little bit of a clean cut man, so to speak. It seems that like he calls kisses icky, and he calls sex like ooh gross. Which is kind of interesting. Like this is such like a clean cut guy. So we eventually have Yuli and Fred watching over a guy who is supposedly doing a novel of sorts, and we end up having Fred assuming that he's doing work, and we end up having Yuli realize that this guy is actually looking at adult sites, let's just say. So we end up having it to where this guy is to look at a certain kind of adult site to where we end up finding out that this guy is gay or so we end up having Yuli like going and realizing like, well, does his wife know like that he is like bi? Like, does she know? And I don't think she actually does know. So we immediately have it to where Yuli and Fred are realizing that this man's woman is coming down the stairs to uh, do a little peeking and realizing that her husband is onto some site of sorts. And so they end up just going right at it onto this desk. And so we end up having Fred basically wanting to look away and completely uh, just stop mentoring or watching over Yuli just because these people are going at it. So Yuli decides that he's like, well, you know what? Like, I'm going to try to get the best of both worlds for this couple. And so we end up having Yuli who ends up appearing in front of this man to ask him, it's like, well, hey, like, does your wife know that you're bi? And the gentleman is like, well, like, no, I don't think that she'll be comfortable with that. I don't think she'll like that I'm like going to be with another man at some point. And so we end up having Hewley going, huh? Okay, well maybe I should go and like myself try and figure this out, like figure out this Rubik's cube of if these two will be comfortable with this. So we end up having Yuli, who is tracking down this man's wife to have people ask her if she would actually be okay with her husband being with another man. So we eventually end up having Yuli, who is at some hairdresser, to where they are to talk about whether or not this woman's husband would be okay with her man being with another man. We end up having Yuli whispering sweet nothings to the hairdresser, and the hairdresser is to talk to this woman about like, well, hey, do you think that he would like? Do you think that your boy would like to be with another man? And do you think he'd like it? And so we end up having another hairdresser and this woman kind of talking it out, like thinking whether or not that he would actually be like accepting of this. And we end up having it to where eventually there's like this back and forth. There's not a real true consensus. And we end up having this woman going like, I don't think my husband would actually accept this. about him like being with another man. Like I would think that it's hot, but I don't think my husband would accept it. To the point where I think it gets down to Yuli when both when Yuli reappears to both man and woman, we end up having Yuli asking this woman, it's like, well, hey, like, do you think that your man would be accepting of another man being with him? It's like, I'm pretty sure that actually he would be pretty accepting of this. But, like, what is your thoughts about it? And so eventually it just gets down to the point to where they're just like, well, F it. You know what? Let's all just throw a party. And if there's probably enough drugs in their system or they're drunk enough or whatever, maybe then they'll actually just experiment on this party. And so we end up having Yuli throwing this costume party. And so we end up having Marion like dressed up as an angel, which is kind of funny. We end up having Yuli dressed up as Nicolas Cage with just a face mask upon his face. We end up having Chun, who is seemingly having some kind of feelings for his person that he is watching over for. Celine, I think her name is. And so we end up having Chun, who's watching over this woman, and it seems that she is going to quite possibly die from a certain ailment soon. And it seems that Celine is going through her life and realizing all the stuff that she didn't do. How she could have basically had two men at the same time just going at it if, like, instead of just kind of keeping to herself and whatever. Like, she could have had two men at the same time and like this and that. Eventually, like, this woman is just starting to puff a cigarette and all kinds of things because she's realizing that her mortality is ending soon. We end up having this woman who is just like just so just so upset about realizing that she is probably going to die. So we end up having Chun, who is really hearing what this woman has to say and realizing how free she is going to become, and Chun isn't. To where we have it to where Chun is like, you know what, I'm starting to have feelings for this woman. And we end up having Greta and we end up having Yuli that it's like, dude, bring her to the party. Like, bring her along. So that way, like, you can eventually, like, kiss her or make out with her or whatever. And so Chun is like, well, you know what, I don't really actually show myself to any of, like, actual people. And, like, Yuli is like, come on, like, just make an exception. So we have Chun who ends up bringing this woman to this party. And so we end up having Greta, who immediately is taking drugs, and immediately we end up having Greta, who is trying to get Chun on drugs on this party, and Chun is like, no, like, I'm not going to take any drugs. So we end up having it to where Fred is to eventually get a screw from this place of where people were to have gotten these balls before. We end up having Fred who ends up getting this screw, and he's like, oh my god, I need to take my entire day off and figure out what this screw and what this nut now means. And we end up having it to where eventually Fred goes and stops messing with his nut and his screw to go to Yuli's party to watch over him. So we end up having it to where Yuli is like, oh my god, Fred is here. And like Greta is doing what she's doing on drugs and all kinds of things. And Chun is trying to get with a woman. Oh my god. And then I'm doing what I'm doing, trying to work out this whole third wheel relationship thing going on. So we end up having eventually Yuli who is to decide to put a ton of drugs within his mouth and eventually go and kiss Fred. So then Fred ends up getting drugs within his mouth as well. And so we end up having Fred, who all of a sudden is like, whoa, like, hey. We end up having Fred who ends up getting all drugged out and is now having the happiest time of his life, to where we have both Chun and Fred, who are to realize that they are having the happiest times of their lives because they had done nothing previously. So we go on to have Yuli, who has this couple. So this guy is to eventually walk off to eventually go and get him and his girl, I guess, a drink. And we end up having a guy with the same similar costume come back, and we end up having this woman kissing this man, and we end up finding out that this other man is actually the veterinarian. And so we end up having this guy's wife like saying, "Oh, I'm sorry, I made a mistake," and we end up having the husband who actually goes in there and walks in there, and she's like, "Oh, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. I kissed another man," and we end up having this man who's like, "Oh no, that's fine." Like, if anything, it kind of got me a little turned on, and so we end up having both this husband and this woman eventually coming to Yuli to decide that they actually want to have a threesome, but they want to have it with Yuli. And so we have it to where Yuli's like, well, no, I'm sorry, I'm already taken. But if anything, I do have a runner-up, which is still the veterinarian. It's like, man, we have to where Yuli is really trying to sell this guy on these people, and I guess eventually they go for it and they have a night out on the town. We eventually have Yuli going to Marion to see like how much money that they've made from this party, uh, and so on and so forth. And so really, I think that I've almost kind of covered everything that happens within these two episodes. I could be wrong or I could be misled, but yeah, like a really fun episode. Uh, Really, I think this show is just really, really fun within these two episodes. But yeah, I think I have kind of covered everything. I think I've covered all my bases. If anything, if I misread or missaid or miss whatever or anything, let me know in the comments below. But with that said, yeah, I think I kind of covered these two episodes, so I think I'm just gonna get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.